When you go silent, something psychological happens to the people around you that they will almost never admit out loud. Their mind starts running calculations it was never running before. Suddenly your presence, which they took completely for granted, becomes a question mark. And question marks, in human psychology, are far more powerful than certainties. This is not theory. This is one of the most well-documented dynamics in behavioral psychology. And once you understand the mechanism behind it, you will never be surprised again by why the people who seemed least interested in you suddenly become the most attentive the moment you stop reaching out. Most people assume that staying visible, staying available, and consistently showing up is how you secure your place in someone's life. And in a healthy relationship, that is partially true. But here is what nobody talks about. Constant availability does not just signal care. Over time, it signals something else entirely. Something that quietly erodes the very connection you are trying to build. It signals that you can be taken for granted. And the human brain, wired as it is for efficiency, will always take the path of least resistance. If someone is always there, always responsive, always emotionally accessible, the brain stops registering their presence as something that requires attention or appreciation. They become background. Reliable, yes, but invisible in the way that all reliable things eventually become invisible. But then one day you just stop. And what happens next is something behavioral psychology has studied for decades. And then something shifts. The consistent person goes quiet. And everything changes. Before we get into exactly why that silence hits so hard psychologically, there is a specific phenomenon that happens in the mind of the person who suddenly notices your absence. Something that explains not just why they start paying attention, but why that attention often comes with a fear they did not expect to feel. We will get to that. And when we do, it will reframe every relationship dynamic you have ever found confusing. First, let us understand what your silence is actually doing to their brain. The moment you go quiet, you trigger something called uncertainty arousal. Uncertainty arousal is what happens when the brain loses access to information it had come to rely on. And the brain's response to that loss is not neutral. It is urgent. Suddenly the mental background process that was quietly tracking your presence gets pulled to the foreground. Where are they? Why have they stopped? Did something change? Did I do something? Is this permanent? None of those questions were being asked before. They did not need to be. You were always there, always answering, always available. Your predictability made you psychologically invisible. Your silence made you impossible to ignore. Here is the strange part. The intensity of their reaction has almost nothing to do with how much they were consciously thinking about you before. It has everything to do with how much their sense of normalcy had quietly incorporated your presence without them realizing it. You were not on their mind, but you were in their baseline. And losing something from your baseline feels categorically different from losing something you were actively focused on. Feels like something is wrong. Like the ground shifted slightly. Like a sound you never noticed has suddenly stopped, and the silence it left behind is louder than the sound ever was. Think about the last time someone who barely texted you suddenly texted 3 times in 1 week. This is exactly why that happened. They were not suddenly more interested in you as a person. Their brain had lost access to a pattern it had unconsciously relied on, and it was scrambling to restore it. That compulsive reaching out was not affection. It was uncertainty arousal in action. And your silence was the trigger. That feeling has a name, which brings us to exactly why it triggers fear. The feeling that gets triggered when you go silent has a name in psychological literature. It is called ambiguous loss. And it is uniquely destabilizing precisely because there is no clear event to process. Nobody died. Nothing officially ended. There was no argument, no announcement, no defined moment of rupture. There is simply absence. And the human mind handles ambiguous loss far worse than it handles concrete loss. When something ends clearly, the brain knows what to do. It grieves, it adjusts, it eventually reorganizes around the new reality. But ambiguous loss offers no such roadmap. The brain cannot grieve what has not been confirmed as gone. So instead it loops. It replays recent interactions, searching for the moment things changed. It generates explanations, discards them, generates new ones. It oscillates between reaching out and holding back. between telling itself it does not matter and checking for the 5th time to see if you have been active recently. This is not weakness in the person experiencing it. It is simply how human cognition responds to unresolved uncertainty about something it had integrated into its sense of normal. And you, without saying a single word, created that uncertainty simply by becoming unavailable. Most people completely miss why this feels so disorienting to the other person. It is not just that they miss you. It is that your silence has forced them to consciously evaluate something they were never consciously thinking about. How much space you actually occupy in their life. And that evaluation almost always reveals more than they were prepared to find. And this is where most people make the mistake that resets everything they just gained. The moment the other person reaches out, the moment that first text arrives, the first unexpected call, the first sign that your silence is working exactly as psychology predicted, most people immediately snap back to their old pattern. They respond instantly. They over-explain their absence. They flood the space with availability again, relieved that the connection has been restored. And in doing so, they erase every bit of recalibration their silence had created. The other person's nervous system resets. The baseline is restored. And within days, the dynamic returns to exactly what it was before. Silence only changes the dynamic when it reflects a genuine internal shift, not a temporary withdrawal followed by an identical return. Here is where it gets really interesting, because ambiguous loss does not just create confusion. It creates a specific emotional response that sits right at the intersection of anxiety and longing. Psychologists call this the approach-avoidance conflict. The person wants to close the distance, to reach out, to restore the familiar pattern, to resolve the uncertainty. But they also feel a resistance they cannot fully explain. A pride, or a fear of what reaching out might reveal about how much they actually care. And that internal conflict, wanting to close the gap but resisting the vulnerability of doing so, is precisely where fear enters the equation. Not fear of you specifically. Fear of what your absence has exposed about their own attachment. Fear that they may have miscalculated how much you mattered. Fear that the balance of the relationship was never quite what they assumed it was. Your silence did not just remove your presence. It removed their certainty about where they stand. And for most people, that is far more uncomfortable than any direct confrontation could ever be. Now here's the part nobody talks about, because it's uncomfortable. The tendency to overgive in relationships rarely comes from pure generosity. It usually comes from something quieter and more personal. Most people who fall into that pattern of overavailability are not doing it because they are naive about how relationships work. They are doing it because somewhere, at a level they rarely examine directly, they do not fully trust that they are worth choosing without the effort. That if they stop reaching, stop initiating, stop making themselves consistently easy to access, the connection will simply dissolve. Because why would anyone stay if you stopped making it easy for them? That belief feels like love. Presents itself as care, as loyalty, as being a dependable person. But underneath it is a quiet fear that your presence alone is not enough. That you have to earn your place in people's lives continuously or risk losing it. And so you stay available. You respond quickly. You initiate more than you receive. You make yourself impossible to lose by making yourself impossible to escape. And here is the painful irony of that strategy. The very behavior designed to prevent abandonment is the behavior that makes you easiest to take for granted. Because when someone never has to wonder whether you will be there, they stop appreciating that you are. Your silence breaks that pattern. Not as a tactic, not as a game, but as an honest recalibration. A moment where you stop over-functioning in the relationship and allow the natural weight of your absence to do what your constant presence never could. It shows both of you simultaneously what the connection actually weighs. And this is where something unexpected happens. Because when you go silent, not out of anger, not to punish, but simply because you have stopped pouring energy into a space that was not filling back up, you start to recover something you did not realize you had lost. Your own sense of value that does not depend on being needed. That shift is quiet. It does not announce itself. But the people around you feel it. Because there is a fundamental difference in the energy of someone who is available because they are afraid to be absent and someone who is present because they genuinely choose to be. One radiates need. The other radiates wholeness. And wholeness is the most attractive and most unsettling thing a person can project, because it cannot be manipulated, cannot be guilt-tripped, and cannot be taken for granted. This is why your silence triggers fear in people who were not treating you as a priority. Not because you became mysterious or hard to reach, but because your silence revealed that you no longer needed their validation to feel complete. And that realization that you might be entirely fine without them is far more confronting than anything you could have said directly. So if you have been showing up fully in relationships that only partially show up for you, consider what your silence might reveal. Not as an experiment in power, as an act of honesty, a quiet way of asking, without words, without confrontation, without drama, whether this connection can hold your absence as well as it has always held your presence. Because the ones worth keeping will notice, and the ones who do not have already answered your question.